Hey, this is Kirk Walden with Coffee with Kirk on the Pregnancy Help Podcast, our 6th episode. And it's great to be back with you. And I think today we're going to give the episode kind of a crazy name, which is this: When God Has Lousy, Perfect Timing. Because I don't know about you, but I have had many moments in my life when God's timing is just terrible. And yet looking back over the years, I see where it is perfect. And that's where we want to go today. And I'll tell a few personal stories, but I want you to take this to heart for yourself and for your ministry. I don't know what you're facing right now. As a ministry, you may be dealing with a lot of staff turnover and we're waiting on timing from God to bring us the right person. Maybe financial turmoil that you're facing and you're saying, God, you're a little late. We're struggling right now. We need you to show up now. Or it may be that you're dealing with a cultural issue with your staff and you're trying to break through and find that moment where all of you are able to come together. You may be dealing with a time where you're getting outside pressures, threats from outside the ministry, or threats from the Christian community on your own ministry. I don't know. But I know that we all go through times when our backs are really against the wall and when we're asking God to move and move now, and He doesn't. And it seems as if He's silent. And it seems as if He has forgotten us. And we look up and we go, come on, God, where are you today? I'm serving you. I'm doing what you called me to do, and you're not there. We don't say that out loud because we're Christian ministries, but in our hearts, we have those moments. So that's what I want to speak to today, because as I mentioned a minute ago, I've had many of those times over my 33 years in this ministry, many of those times when I felt like God was not there, when I didn't know what the future held. And yet at the same time, He showed up in a perfect timing. And as I look back, things happened that made me who I am today, who I get to be today, and what I get to do today because of His lousy, perfect timing. So let's just kind of get into it. If we want to talk about God's timing, we can look at Jesus' life and how He used His own Son to show how His timing is lousy but perfect. And I think the perfect example, you all know this one, is the example of Lazarus. And when Lazarus was sick, when the people came to Jesus and said, your friend Lazarus is sick, you got to go to him. And Jesus stayed 2 more days where he was. That's lousy timing. And it was lousy timing for Mary and Martha because when He got to their home, they had to tell him Lazarus is dead. He already knew that. But they didn't know what was about to happen. They were struggling. They were hurting. And they were asking, how in the world did you wait to come to us? We were counting on you. You know what was in their hearts. And they felt like their friend Jesus had let them down when they knew He could do the miracle. They knew He could save his life. And He let them down. I don't know if you felt like that, but I have. And yet Jesus, with that lousy timing, He tells them to open the tomb, and Lazarus walks out, and they got to see a miracle beyond anything they could imagine. Because Jesus waited for His Father to tell Him when to go, and when He got there, He was able to do one of the greatest miracles we see in Scripture, raising the dead. And man, did that change things in the ministry. And it changed things for Mary and Martha. And you think they didn't follow for the rest of their lives. Boy, I'm sure they didn't go anywhere after that. Because sometimes the lousiest timing is perfect. And I do think about my life and times when I've had my back against the wall. I was a new director of a pregnancy help ministry in 1991, which is back in the dark ages. But when I got there, we had a couple of $1,000s in a savings account. I was so excited. I was like, man, we're going to grow this ministry, we're going to do great things. And I was feeling the excitement. I got there in the 1st of March. We had our first banquet in the middle of March. I had not planned it or anything, and the banquet barely broke even. We actually had to count our checks so that we could write the check to the hotel to pay for the banquet. We barely broke even. It was terrible. And I was still excited, still going forward. We're going to get beyond this. I remember we had 109 people give at that banquet, and I wrote 109 personal thank you notes because, by golly, I'm going to thank these people. And I guess that gave rise to my later books, the thank you note books that many of you have purchased through Heartbeat International. But back then, I thought all I need to do is thank people. And if I thank people, the funds will come. We will be fine. I'll never have to ask for funds. Never have to do it. I'd never been through a development training, didn't know anything about that stuff. We only had our one event, the banquet, and it was going to be great, but it wasn't, and we had nothing else. But I still thought we'd be fine. Well, we get to May and June and July, and the funds dry up, and we have nothing. And all of a sudden, I'm waiting for a paycheck. I'm making sure other people are paid, but I realize that as the director of the ministry, the leader, if somebody's going to wait on a paycheck, it's got to be me. I didn't know how to ask for funds. We did a fundraising letter. I don't advise this letter very often. Do it once, but if you do it more than once, people are going to be asking questions. We wrote this letter and said, hey, our funding is dried up. We're struggling right now. And we got some funds in, but it still wasn't enough. And I had no idea what to do. And I'll never forget a board meeting. I prayed. I can promise you that. I prayed, but God had not shown up. And I remember very well a board meeting where we sat around the table. One of our board members said, well, other than salaries, our biggest expense is the phone. Phone bill is the biggest expense we have. And probably on a monthly basis at that time it was. Well, he said, we need to shut off the phones. And he said, but when we shut off the phones, we know we've shut down the ministry. And I remember we didn't make the decision final that night, but I remember going home that night and laying down and saying, God, you put me in this position. I know that it was your calling to put me here, and I've been here just since February. And now here we are, whatever it was, 5-6 months later, and they are going to shut this ministry down. It's the largest ministry in our area, and I will always be known as the guy who ruined it. Thank you, God, for what you've done. You have made me the scapegoat for this ministry, and I have no idea what to do next. I was upset because God's timing was lousy. But here's what happened. Before the next board meeting, we were still struggling through. A couple of things happened, in fact. I got a lot of humility because I'll never forget we had a billboard that we had bought many years ago, and I can't remember what the payment was, but we had gotten behind on our payments for that billboard. And a guy comes in from the billboard company saying, we need a check. But the guy who needed the check was a good bit younger than me. And in fact, when I had been 15 years old, I had been his babysitter. Because there are a couple of families in our neighborhood that wanted a guy to babysit their boys. And I babysat him. And I thought, man, here I am. I was the babysitter for this kid. And now he's coming in here and looking at me in an embarrassed way, because we knew each other, and asking me for money because I couldn't pay my bill. And that was tough. But again, God's timing, while lousy, is also perfect. Because at the next board meeting, one of our board members came in and he had settled a case. He was an attorney. He settled a case and he brought me a check. He slipped it to me before the board meeting. And it was for $7,812.50. I do remember quite well what that check was for because it saved us. And we were able to do another letter. We were able to say some more things about where we were. And we were able to see our funds begin to grow. And because of that situation, I looked at it and I said, we never need to do that again. And a year later, or within the next 6 or 8 months, we decided to have a walk for life for the first time. It raised some funds. We revamped our banquet so that it would be a fundraising event instead of a break-even event. And we did some other things as well. And as we did, I realized that because God's timing was so lousy, I learned things about development that I still put into practice today when I'm helping pregnancy centers. And I think, okay, God, your lousy timing is often perfect. Because, and this is, I wouldn't want to say this is a principle, but this is an idea that came out of it for me, which is there's always something to be gained when God's timing is lousy. Now, I don't know. Maybe I should advocate for this more. I don't know that we should always be praying, what do you want to teach me? Because it's almost like when I say that, maybe that's perfect for you. But when I say that, I think, well, then I haven't learned, or I haven't grown, or I'm short, or I am in sin, or something like that. What are you trying to teach me? So maybe I get it all wrong, but I would rather ask the question of God when we're in a fix and God's timing appears to be lousy, to ask the question, is there something to be gained here? If we pull out of this, if we get past this, can I gain something that will help us for years to come in any situation? And I think about the fact that, let's say our culture in our center is not what we want it to be. People are they're not quite jibing with each other. There's struggles. Well, is there something, if I'm a leader in the ministry, or even if I'm a staff member and I answer to the leader, is there something I can gain from this? Is there something that I can do? Not that I'm doing something bad, but is there something I can gain to make this ministry better? And I think about the leader, the director. Are there things I can read on leadership that will help me and help all of our staff down the road? Is there something I can learn about? And I just got a call as I was about to do this podcast from a best friend who had to let somebody go. And I won't go into his profession, and it wasn't anything in pregnancy help. But in his profession, there was somebody who had reached a point where he was no longer able to function. He's an older fella and no longer able to function in his task. And people were having to cover for him. And he finally had to say, I've got to make a change here and bring someone else in. And my friend, being who he is, went to the person's daughter, talked to her, and she was like, yeah, it's time. And we all know it's time for Dad to let this go. And I just think he did not want to do this, but he had to do it. But he gained from it because he learned how to do some hard things. Letting somebody go is not an easy thing. He hasn't had to do that in his particular profession. And I think, what is it that can be gained here when God's timing is lousy? Can we ask that question? What if God moves in an extraordinary way? What can be gained? And I ran into this during my days as a single dad. Many of you know that for over 9 years I was a single dad. And after 3 years with the ministry, I went to our board of directors several times and I said, maybe I need to step aside. And they'd said, nope, you need to stay right here. And finally, I did reach that point, and I thought, I can't give this job my best. I know I can't give it my best, but I want to be involved in pregnancy help, but I also want to be close to my kids. And so as it was, I won't go into all the details, but I landed a job at my kids' private school. And there, one of my jobs at the school, one of my key jobs was being their development director. And it's so interesting that while I was a development director, immediately after I started, the school started a capital campaign. And I'm like, wow, of all things, I'm learning how to do a capital campaign, something I didn't learn at the center. And now I get to share what I learned about capital campaigns with centers across the country. And it was because God's timing was lousy, because I want to go back. Before I took that job, I started a little company called Life Trends. And with that company, I had a newsletter that went to Pregnancy Help Ministries. A few hundred centers subscribed, but it wasn't enough to feed the family. And I had left my job at the pregnancy center and started Life Trends, hoping that would carry me through. It didn't carry me through at all. And I had reached a point where I couldn't make ends meet for my family, and I had to pull my kids out of the Christian school they were in. But that, with God's lousy timing, was how I landed the job at the Christian school. Because I was out of choices, could not go back to the pregnancy center. They had already hired somebody, and he was a great director. They had already hired somebody. So I needed to find something else, and that's how I wound up at my kids' school. And there I learned how to do capital campaigns. And there I learned things about development that I hadn't learned at pregnancy centers. And because I had already started Life Trends, I could keep it going and stay involved in pregnancy help community even while working at the school. And I'll tell you one more thing. Even at the school, they gave me a starting teacher's salary, which is hard when you're raising 3 kids on your own. And Life Trends brought in a little income, but not a lot. So I needed something else. So I put out there, I'd hired speakers for my banquets for years, and I put out there through my little Life Trends newsletter that I'm also a banquet speaker. I'm so thankful for Terry Winship up in Casper, Wyoming, with True Care up there, that she didn't ask the question, have you ever done this before? She didn't ask me that question. I went up there. I'd also done some training for setters on banquets and other things. And I went up there and I went to the banquet. It went well, spoke at the banquet, scared to death, but it went fairly well. I sent a tape to an agency in Nashville, and they brought me on as a speaker. And now, for 23 years, I've been speaking at events. And fortunately, I think those events, I don't really keep up anymore, but it's somewhere in the $70 to $80 million range that I've had an opportunity to be a part of raising. I don't ever say that, boy, it was my talk that did it. But I've been a part of raising all that. And it's all because God's timing was lousy. God's timing was lousy for me to be a single dad, and I had to find a way to make a living. God's timing didn't bring in the funds that I wanted through Life Trends. God's timing was lousy in that I had to work at this school to make ends meet. God's timing was lousy in that I had to take on this role as a speaker. But as most of you know, later on, Jarrell and Heartbeat came to me, Peggy Hartshorn being president at the time, but Jarrell came to me and asked me if I could partner with Heartbeat or they could partner with me with my little Life Trends company. And then I ended up bringing Life Trends under the Heartbeat umbrella a few years later in 2014 and going on staff with Heartbeat for many years. And now I'm on volunteer staff is what I call it. And I think it all happened because God's timing was lousy and yet perfect. I learned things through those capital campaigns that I've been able to pass on to Pregnancy Center. I learned things about development that are far beyond what I learned in the capital campaign by working at that school. And I pass them on to pregnancy centers today. And I think, what can be gained here when we're up against the wall? What can we learn here when we're up against the wall? When God's timing doesn't seem to line up with mine. And I would love to say that I'm that pious person who, when I ask for something and God says, wait, or God says, not yet, or God says, no, when those things happen, I would love to say that I quietly submit and say, thank you, God, for this, and I have learned. I'm closer to that point now than I used to be, but I really believe that God listens to us, and he kind of smiles and says, if you'd only ask one question, what might be gained here? What can you learn here? Look at those things. And I just said earlier, I'm not big on the what is God trying to teach me, but there are things that we can gain and learn from. And I think that sometimes when we're going through that very, very difficult and challenging time, the culture in our center is not what we want it to be. We're having staff turnover because of just things that happen, or there's a threat to the ministry. You know, there are ministries that are in the crosshairs of organizations in your community and some of your communities out there. There are other places where churches are upset with you for a reason. You may have changed your website to clients a little bit, and there are churches saying, well, I don't like the way you're doing that. And you're having to negotiate all of that. And you're asking for favor, and you're not getting it. Is there something that can be gained here? Because even if God's timing seems lousy, sometimes it's perfect because there is something spilling over my words, there is something to be gained. And I really believe that when we struggle, there's always something to be gained. And I want you to be thinking about the challenges you may be facing right now. And if you're listening to this as a staff, look at each other and go, we're struggling right now as a group. Or there is this threat from outside or whatever. What if we brainstormed and said, what can be gained? What can we gain from this? And I'll leave you with this. As many of you know, me and Jen are writing this book, Saving Samaria. Samaria, as we know, was that place that no Jew would go to. It was a terrible land, according to any good traditional Jew. They had left the faith. They were once Jewish. They were once Israelites, but through a series of circumstances, they had left. And now they were that lost tribe way out there. And as Jesus started his ministry, I'm sure his disciples wondered, why in the heck are you going to Samaria? What is making you go there? We've got enough to deal with here in Jerusalem and Judea. Why go there where he would meet the woman at the well, who we've talked about on another episode? What there is worth our trouble? Those people are heretics. They're traitors to the faith. We don't need anything to do with them. You're the Messiah. Let them come to you. But Jesus went to them because he realized if this horrible social divide, if we can bridge this divide, this conflict that seems unsolvable, if we can bridge this, if we can win those people, we're going to find a place. We're going to find in Samaria a haven and safe place for the church. And there the church can take off. And sure enough, he goes to Samaria. He meets the Samaritan woman. She goes and evangelizes for him. Other things happen regarding Samaria in the Gospels. But we see in the book of Acts that when the first persecution comes after Stephen's stoning, when that first persecution comes, a lot of Christians run to Samaria because it's safe there, because there are no Jews there. They won't go there. It's a safe place. And there, Philip goes in and starts a true awakening so big that Peter and John have to go up there to figure out what in the world is happening and lay hands on the people, that the Holy Spirit would come to each of those people in Samaria who have begun to follow Jesus Christ. A huge awakening up there. And as we get to the end of Acts chapter 8, we see that the church is having peace in Jerusalem. Let's see if I've got it right. Galilee, Judea, and in Samaria. I don't have the verse in front of me, but we see the church is thriving there. Samaria becomes a key home for the church, all because of Jesus, who saw God's timing wasn't perfect here. It was lousy. We've got a split Israel when the Messiah comes. That's not good. But Jesus saw it and said, what can be gained here? I can win Samaria, and we will have a new haven for the church. Folks, I'll leave you with that. What can be gained when God's timing is lousy? Because it may be perfect. I appreciate you guys. You can always email me at kirk@kirkwalden.com. If I can do anything for you, let me know. I'm excited about our next episode coming up, and I'm thankful that you listened today. Have a great day. Thanks for listening to Coffee with Kirk.